America was a hot topic in Europe from 1600 to 1700s, and a lot of people came for religious freedom and for land. In 1620, when the pilgrims were just arriving, there were almost 200 people in each colony. After 1776, 150 years later, the population was 2.5 million. Wow. Most immigrants were British. By 1776, 25% of the British Isles had moved to America. Each colony had established British forts and soldiers to govern them. The 13 colonies were here. And let me show you a picture of them. This is the 13 colonies from Massachusetts all the way down the eastern coast until you get to Georgia. Those were the ones that we will be talking about. They're the ones that had state constitutions already set up. They had, and they were the ones that signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. These are the states that were important in founding our Constitution. The First Continental Congress was called, and it was organized mainly by George Washington's plea because the colonies all had some concern about how the King of England was disagreeing with them and disregarding them. Things got worse. After the French and Indian War, England was burdened with debt, and so they started the Stamp Act and then the Townshend Act, imposing even more taxes. And we all know how that didn't go over very well because we had the Boston Tea Party happen. Armed conflict started after the Boston Tea Party. The battles of Concord and Lexington started with the colonists fighting for their rights, not independence, but their rights. So George Washington asked for the First Continental Congress to be called, and in it they discussed 6 main points. The first was taxation without representation in Parliament. In England, this was illegal, and it was already set up with English government that you should have representation if you're going to be taxed. And since they were considered part of England as under the British rule, and they were taxed heavily, they should at least always have representation in Parliament, but they didn't. The second thing they complained about was forcing colonists to house and quarter troops. They needed to learn some respect for other people's property. As a child, I learned this too. Before I tell you that story, I want to talk about what the soldiers were doing. They would go just to anybody's house and say, "We need you to house us here, so you'll have to live in one of the bedrooms," or sometimes they kicked them out of the house. And they ate their food, they damaged things, they were disruptive, and then they would go their merry way. But they took advantage of the people who were living there, and that's called housing and quartering the troops. And it was disrespectful of their property. When I was a little girl, I'm going to tell you this story because I forgot to get it out. When I was a little girl, I loved to jump, and there weren't trampolines readily available. And so my dad and mother's big bed was the best I could find. It was better than the single beds and definitely better than a bunk bed to jump on. So I would jump, I'd get a fair amount of air going up. And I would come down and try to do twists and somersaults and all kinds of things. It was great fun. I occasionally would knock something over on the side of the bed, and I have broke a lamp that my mom and dad had at the side of their bed. My mother kept on telling me to stop jumping on her bed. She made her bed every morning, and she made it with this beautiful silky like bedspread that was on it that made it so easy to jump because your feet would just slide on it. And anyway, it was a lot of fun. Well, my mother complained to my father, so my father told me I needed to stop jumping on the bed. And I just one day the bed was calling me, and I went in and started jumping on the bed again. And I fell off the bed and pulled the bedspread, and the bedspread pulled down some of my mother's trinkets and things that were on the side table to their bed. And things went crashing, and oh, I got in so much trouble. And my mother noticed that the stitches were starting to come out of her bedspread. And so my dad sat me down and talked to me and told me how disappointed he was in me, which was worse than if he'd spanked me. And he told me that that was so disrespectful of other people's property, that that bedroom meant a lot to his mother, to my mother, and to him. And he said that when I jumped on the bed when I was told not to, it was disrespecting their property. My mother had liked to keep things nice in there, and that bedspread was made by her aunts and her mother for her, and that stitches were popping out on it because I had been jumping on that. And that was one of the last things she had that my mother helped make for her. So I kind of learned a little bit of respect that day for other people's property. I was grounded from going into my dad and mother's bedroom, and I, I think it was, looking back on it now, I think it was well-founded advice that you need to learn to respect other people's property, and that's how the colonists felt. They wanted their property to be, it was their sanctuary, and they wanted it to be protected, and they wanted it to be treated with respect. So, the next thing that they complained about in the First Continental Congress was transporting colonists overseas for trials, and and protecting the soldiers from punishment for murder. This kind of thing was going on, and it just blows my mind to think of this, but they would put the people who were going to trial on a ship and send them back to England to have a trial in England, where there was nobody who knew them, and they didn't understand the circumstances that the settlers were living in America. And and that's they didn't have a speedy trial by any means if they had to go clear across the ocean to have a trial. And then that the soldiers protecting them even from having any consequences from committing murder or theft or destroying other people's property. The fourth thing they discussed was dissolving co- colonial assemblies and preventing for new laws that met their needs. They would go to the governor, the British governor, and they would say, "We need to change this. Here in America, things are different than they are over in England. We need a different law that takes care of our needs right here." And they wouldn't have anything to do with it. Plus, they were making it so that the colonists could not have any assemblies to talk about things or parties or some church meetings even. They just didn't allow them to do that. And then the fifth thing that they complained about was keeping a standing army in peacetime. The military was superior to civil power. So the people had no rights. They were the civil people. They had no rights, and the military had all the rights. And some of them got really high-handed. And sometimes we see that happen with our own police officers. They get a little bit of power in their heads and they go crazy with it. Not all police officers are that way. Matter of fact, very few are. Most of them are there to serve, but there are a few. It happens. Um, and keeping standing armies, they just walked around with their guns, with their rifles, among all the people. I remember going to Germany with Bethany right after the Lebanon uh, embassy had been bombed, and there was a high alert out. So when we got off the plane and walked into the Frankfurt uh, airport, there were soldiers standing with rifles all over the place. And it was a little jarring to me to see that happen. I wasn't used to having a standing army around me. Even though they were supposed to be there to protect me, it still just kind of was unsettling. Okay, the sixth thing that they complained about was creating new offices to harass people and burning towns and destroying lives. And they were doing this because the colonists were getting to a point where they were not very obedient to the soldiers and to the officers from England that had been sent over to govern them. And so they started creating offices and finding ways to harass people. And they did burn complete towns sometimes. The intent of the First Continental Congress was to send these grievances in a letter. And this is what they wanted to do, was a letter of grievances. I'm going to take down the Continental Congress so you can see this a little better. Where's my arrow? There it is. A letter of grievances. This this is why this is important. It just makes sense. If you want to settle a problem, you you go in and you talk about it and try to balance your grievances and make compensation one with another so that you can come to a resolution. Well, this First Continental Congress, what we've been talking about, was all worded in a letter of grievance, and it was sent to the King of England, um, King George III. Each colony was to send at least 2 men to represent them in the Continental Congress. And so they had at least 26 delegates there who signed this letter of grievance. And when King George got the letter, he considered the colonists to be rebels, and he wouldn't even reply to them. So then George Washington organized the next Continental Congress. This one was called when apparently they were being disregarded by the king. The desperate colonists met to unify themselves and declare inherited right, life and liberty and pursuit of happiness that the British government was violating. They wanted other nations to know formally that we were declaring our rights to become a nation. So they decided they were going to assign the Declaration of Independence. And that's what happens next in this Second Continental Congress. The Declaration of Independence was sent to several nations. It was reviewed as an act of war by of rebellious citizens, and thus the Revolutionary War started. With King George III signed the treaty at the end of it in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. 7 years we were at war with the Revolutionary War to claim our independence. The United States Declaration of Independence profoundly influenced other nations. It provided a model for governing, natural law of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It has inspired independent movements globally, from the French Revolution to the Latin America. In it, um, they found the blueprint for oppressed people fight seeking freedom. America, it has been a it has been a blueprint for all opposed people seeking liberty and freedom. The men who signed the Declaration of Independence put their lives on the line. The closing statement says, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." They put themselves willingly to be tried by England for high treason, and they knew that's what they were doing. The penalty for high treason was this: to be hung by the head until unconscious, then cut down and revived, then disemboweled and beheaded, then cut into 4 quarters, each quarter to be boiled in oil. The remnants were scattered abroad so that the last resting place of the offender would not would remain forever unnamed, unhonored, and unknown. Wow. This certainly would make most men think twice, let alone sign their name to a paper that would convict them of high treason. Structure of a new country needed to come about, and pretty fast, because they knew they'd just declared independence. So they started with the Articles of Confederation. This was more about state rights. It was because apparently there were too many loopholes in it that they needed for the federal government with some power. So they later had to do the Constitution because of those loopholes. But for the time being, they were all for state rights and a little gun shy of giving the federal government too much power over them. So the Articles of Federation were too closely to the anarchy scale on a slide rule. Oh, let's take down that picture so you can see this now. This is anarchy. It's opposite of this is anarchy. It is where there is no law and there's mobs and people are just out of control. This is 100% tyranny. It's ruler's law, where they are in control. We've talked about these kind of societies last time. People's law is what we wanted. And with the Articles of Federation, people's law was really close to anarchy because it didn't leave them with much government hardly any government on a federal level, and their states were a little sketchy even at that. So it was a problem for them. And so they knew that eventually they were going to have to find something and do something different with the Articles of Federation and bring this closer to the middle where its people's law is supposed to be. The structure of a new country had left them with no executive leaders, no judges to enforce powers, and no taxation for the country. The Articles of Federation were written and signed and in haste, and when the Declaration of Independence was sent out, we needed some kind of government, some kind of umbrella for the states for security. George Washington was the driving force in calling this convention, and a group of 5 men were called from that convention to write the Constitution for our country. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and John Adams were some of the main contributors. We will spend more time studying these marvelous men of that day, but they will be inserted as we go forward. You already know the history of this time span pretty well, from 1700 to 1800, and I am, however, going to spend time talking about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the amendments that govern our country and protect our freedom. So let's get started with understanding some of this a little better. I'm going to show you another picture. It's a picture of a three-headed eagle. Let me move it up just a little bit. Whoops. Well, it's not going to move. Okay. What it is what it is. The three-headed eagle. The center head represents the legislative branch of the government. The legislative branch of the government is the House and the Senate. And I wanted to tell you a story about peer pressure, because when you elect officials to represent you in the legislature, in the House of Representatives or your senators, you need to make sure you have people who are not prone to buckle under peer pressure, because there's a lot of peer pressure in the legislature, with people with money and people with power and people coming and begging and bartering, and lobbyists bartering for, you vote for this and then we'll vote for this, and there's a lot of that goes on. One rainy day while walking to school, I became aware I had grown up. Okay, I need my glasses. I'm struggling with reading today without them. Worms had appeared on the sidewalk from the rain washing them out of the grass, and as a child I would pick them up and let them wiggle and tickle my sand. I had become a young woman, so I shivered at the sight and hopped over them like the other girls did. My priorities in junior high were friends and schoolwork. They linked together because they both resulted in what people thought of me. It had become important to me to look like and act like and be like the right group of people. In elementary school, I was there to learn, but in junior high, I was there to impress. Peer pressure was everything. On a rainy morning, while walking to school, my friends and I were discussing our first period class we were dreading. It was beginning foods, and the teacher was so boring. We would be baking muffins for our midterm grade that day. Suddenly, one of the girls suggested that we take one of the worms from the sidewalk with us to school. The plan was to put the worm in a muffin and then have our teacher taste it for our grade. We all laughed at the idea, but these girls were serious. All of them were too afraid to pick up the worm, so I did and carefully put it in my pocket. In class, we made our muffins, and then I cautiously retrieved the worm and placed it in the middle of a muffin. We marked the top with a glob of dough with a swirl on it so that we'd know which one had the worm in it. They looked great when they came out of the oven. The one we marked was easy to identify, and we plated the muffins so the worm muffin was at the top. About this time, I was feeling uneasy and guilty, and guilt was setting in on me. I was nervous. My pulse rate was high, and I had sweaty palms. I knew deep inside it was wrong. While in this turmoil, the teacher came to our table. I opened my mouth to say, "Don't," but before I uttered a peep, she took the top muffin and broke it in half to check the texture before she tasted it. So it exposed that worm. It was still plump and staring her right in the eye. She screamed, dropped the muffin, and jumped back 6 feet. People laughed, but the teacher looked at me. She asked who did this, and when all fingers did point to me, I then knew who my friends were and were not. The principal was very cold, and his expression didn't warm me up any either. By the time my dad arrived, the room just got frigid. I was expelled from school for a day and incarcerated to my bedroom. I was allowed bathroom privileges only. During this banishment from mankind, I did some soul searching. This was probably the outcome my parents had hoped for. I realized that I had let peer pressure determine my actions rather than my own good common sense and morals. Never again would I let this happen to me. I would rather be miserable and be a loner and guilty than guilty, thoughtless puppet in the hand of a group of kids. That's the day I became me. Just me, not letting any part of me do something just to be like others. Peer pressure never brings happiness, and happiness comes from inside you, being the best you can. I um I I learned that, and I think that's a good analogy for looking for good people to be in our House of Representatives and our Senate. Now, the next one is the left side, the executive head right here. That's the executive branch of the government. By the way, these three things are what is talked about in the Constitution. This is what it is all about. So now we're going to talk about the legislative branch. And I have a story about that too. And the story is a story of George Washington. He was fighting battles and trying to keep his troops in good morale. When it became winter time, the states were supposed to send food and clothing and ammunition for them and provide for them. And the states were not doing that. And he was watching his men just suffer. Um, he um, he said that there were blood streaks in the snow where the men were walking with their bare feet because their shoes had holes in them. And they were huddled around fires with blankets around them. They had very little food. And he was, the men were wanted to go home. They just didn't want to be there. They wanted food. They wanted to see their family, and they weren't fighting right then, and so they just wanted to go home. So the men who had been chosen from these militias were from the states, and they wanted to go home too, and they felt that George Washington was making a poor choice as their leader by keeping the men there. So they gathered together in a group, and they decided they were going to go to him and tell him they were leaving, and they were going to encourage the men to leave. And then they went as a group, all fired up, ready to go. They went to George Washington's tent, and the guard there said, "He isn't here." He got on his horse and he rode over that hill. And so they walked up to the top of that hill to see if they could see where he was. And he was not too far away from where they were when they were at the top of the hill. He was kneeling he had his horse with him, and he was kneeling on the ground, and he was praying. He was asking Heavenly Father to bless him to know what to do to lead these men. He talked about the need for freedom, the need for independence. He talked about the need for a new country. And he truly believed in what they were fighting for. He asked for the men to be healed. He asked for reinforcements to come, for food and clothing to come. He just pleaded with the Lord. And after hearing him, offer this prayer, the officers that were standing at the top of the hill turned around and walked back down the hill, and they encouraged the men to stay. Now, that's the kind of leader George Washington was. And he um, got the respect and the love of his men because he was that kind of a leader. That's the kind of leader that we should have in the United States. We haven't had one like that since George Washington, I don't think. They have a big shoes to step into when they become president of the United States. Um, I I think we should, however, hold that as the ideal of what we would like for a president when we vote for a president. Okay, the next one on the next head on this eagle is the judicial branch, right here. Um, the judicial head is the judges, the Supreme Court. There's a need for them. Um, and I have a story about that too. And I think I'm just going to tell you this story. When I was 17 years old, I just graduated from high school, but I hadn't had my 18th birthday yet in August. And I had a job, and on my way home from work, I rode home with some of my coworkers, and we they stopped in front of my house, and I got out on the side of the car that I was sitting on, right behind the driver. And then they were all still laughing, and we were talking, and I was talking to them inside the driver's window, which was rolled down. And a car came up, and it hit me, and it picked up my body, and it threw me up on the hood of the car, and I rolled off into the oncoming traffic lane. I remember moving my head and seeing a car coming for me, and I knew it was going to run over my legs. And I instantly felt hands or pressure under me, and my body was flipped. And I looked up, and the car, I could see the undercarriage of the car up above me, and it went right over the top of me, and it never hit me. The man who was driving that car was screeching his brakes, and he stopped his car, and mother said he put his head on the steering wheel and he was sobbing. He knew he had hit me. There was no way he couldn't have hit me. But I miraculously had been saved. Um, then my friends jumped out of their car, and they ran in and got my mother and my sister, and they came out. And um, an ambulance was called, and this was the worst part of the whole thing. I had to ride backwards in an ambulance, and I got so car sick. Oh my goodness, I was car sick. And they took me to the hospital, checked me over, and I just had bumps and bruises, but I was all right. Um, the police officer came up to the hospital to talk to me about it and what happened. And I told him the truth. I told him exactly what had happened. As much as I knew it had happened in a split second, but I told him where I was standing, what I was doing. So he gave me a ticket for standing in the roadway. He also gave the old woman a ticket for hitting me and leaving the scene of a crime because she just kept going. And anyway, I ended up having to go to juvenile court. I was the only one of my parents' 6 children that had to go to juvenile court with them. And we went, and at that time, girls wore dresses everywhere they went. You didn't wear slacks. And so I put on my Sunday dress, which was a beautiful white dress. And then it had a little bit of lace on the front of it. And then I had a really wide pink satin bow that I put the sash around my middle and tied it in a big bow in front of me, and then had ribbon hanging down. And I went to juvenile court with my dad and mom, and they called me in and they told me that I had to sit up on the front bench with all the other offenders, so I did. And there I am. You have to picture this. My dad told me how comical it looked to him. There's this row of boys. I'm the only girl. And they're all in black leather or shaggy hair, just really rough looking young men. And the judge comes in and looks, and my dad said he smirked. I know he smirked. I saw him smirk. So anyway, when he came to me, he asked me what my offense was. I told him I was standing in the roadway and I got hit by a car. And he said to me, "Well, it sounds like you've learned your lesson, have you?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I did, the hard way." And he said, "You're released." And so it was dismissed and I was able to go home. Now, had I been in a different state, it might have been a different law, because every state has their own laws for traffic, and so I, if I would have been um, told that I had to do some kind of recompense for the crime of standing in the roadway, I could have appealed that and had a trial by jury. And if I didn't agree with that, I could appeal that and have a state court. And if I appealed that, I could have had a federal Supreme Court hearing. You work your way up in the judicial system, and there's all these different courts so that your rights are protected from anybody who might have any inkling to make life rough for you in the judicial system. So it's supposed to work to protect you as an individual. Okay, that's my 3 stories that go along with the 3-headed eagle. All governments, federal, state, and city, follow the same pattern. They have these 3 heads to their government. Um, the the founders decided preserving freedom could only be done if political and economic power came from the people. They separated power horizontally and vertically. That had never been done before. They looked at the best ideas of all the countries, empires, and dynasties before them and were inspired with the best ever form of government. In a nutshell, it is the Constitution. That is what the Constitution is about, the structure and duties of the 3 heads of government. Now, we talked about vertical and horizontal powers. We're going to talk about the vertical powers in this podcast. We'll use the horizontal in another. Let's see. We need to change back here so you can see this poster. I don't know. I made this too big, evidently. Let me see if we can get it in here. Vertical separation of power for local level. At the bottom, where the power is the family. The family has a representative who is the adults in the family, and they vote, and they go to the township or the city you live in, and they vote for those officials. Then you go and you've also vote for your county government and your state government. And this is how the process of laws and government goes: the family, the city, the county, and the state. That's the way vertically that the power goes. With the federal government, it's horizontally, and we'll talk about that later. 2 new concepts of developing a government, and they are amazing concepts. These vertical powers, the family is the foundation of society. They solve their problems and they are responsible for the health, the welfare, the education of their family. And when the family cannot meet those needs, then the city is to help. The city or township is a community that elect a group in charge of streets, water, fire, a fire station, not making fires, but a fire station, and police, sanitation, education, solving family disputes. And to begin with, that's where education was. It was, with the family be ultimately responsible that their children are educated. The township or the city was in charge of education for their town, for their schools and their towns. Later on, it became part of the responsibility of the state to regulate that. But originally, it was only supposed to be for the townships. The county community problems are resolved by elected officials. They are to provide a county jail, county prosecutor, roads, and places that are unincorporated. They were to supply a sheriff, a jail, police, fire, and water. Now, Grandpa and I live in unincorporated Ada County. And so the county has assigned us to the city of Cuda for our sheriff help, our jail help, our police help, our fire, and our water. The state elected officials handle all problems involving all the county disputes, the highways, fish and game, parks, forest, pest control, liquor, mental ill hospital, prison, drugs, tax collection, highway patrol. Notice things like education were originally under the townships, not the county or the state or the federal government. Also, the parks and wildlife were a state responsibility, not that of the federal government. This brings government right down to grassroots. It is stable then, and the rest of the government can be too. To have ordinary people represent you in these positions was a new concept. Before then, it was the king born to rule, and the king chose local government officials, and the whole thing ended up being the Good Boys Club. Your freedoms depended on who you knew and who you were related to. I hope you are feeling a sense of gratitude for the integrity and the courage of the men who constructed and signed the Declaration of Independence. Next time, we'll be talking about the federal government that has checks and balances. Until then, may God be with you till we meet again.